Hey there folks, in today's tutorial we are going to learn how to make this shiny ground in After Effects. Let's get started. Alright, so here we are, we've got After Effects open, and the only thing we're going to need from outside of After Effects is a texture for the ground. So what I've got today is this photo of rusted sheet metal. It doesn't really matter what texture you have, as long as it's something a little bit grungy. There's a lot of difference between the light and dark areas. Doesn't matter if it's in color, because we can make it black and white. We're gonna up the contrast. You'll kind of see how it works, but you will need to have some form of texture for the ground. So let's start by making a new composition. We're gonna call this ground texture. All right, we're gonna leave all the other settings basic, 1920, 1080, 29.97, and let's go ahead and just make everything for this tutorial 10 seconds long. There we go. And let's go ahead and bring in that ground texture. All right. So first things first, I'm gonna rotate this 90 degrees and scale it down. Now I could make the scale the exact same size as the comp, but I want just a little bit more detail. And the way I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna bring it down. I'd say right about here, that'll work. And I'm gonna add the CC Reptile effect. Now, you'll notice I press Control Space, this little thing pops up. If you don't know what it is, this is FX Console. It is my #1 cannot live without plugin. It isn't required for anything, but it just makes things so much easier, so much faster. I'm a big fan of it. So let's go ahead and add the CC Reptile effect. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna repeat our layers. You can see here, I'm expanding the right. Now, technically this is down, but because we've rotated this layer, the right is now down. Doesn't really matter. So let's go ahead and bring this out till we think we don't need it anymore. Looks like that's gonna be about 550. Let's go ahead and make it the same for the left. And then let's go ahead and do the other two. Let's see how far we need to go. Looks like about 1400. Now, I could just drag these numbers out really far, but that increases render time. It increases, the amount of power After Effects has to use in order to keep rendering this layer. Just use exactly what you need. That's kind of the best way to go. The next thing is we're gonna change this from repeat to random. You'll see here it kind of randomized my whole texture, but now we've got these really sharp lines where we don't want them. So we're gonna use blend borders. I'd say probably around 60-ish. Yeah. And so you can see now, kind of a nice seamless texture. There's a couple bit of, repeating areas, but you're not gonna see them, they're not gonna show up, not a big deal. Next thing we're gonna add is, let's go ahead and add a hue and saturation. There we go. And we're gonna use this to drop our master saturation all the way down. Let's go ahead and add a brightness and contrast. And let's go ahead and switch this to legacy. And let's bump up this contrast real high. Say right about there. And let's bump up our brightness right about there. So the goal with this texture is we want the areas that are white to be crystal clear, no blur, and we want the areas that are dark and gray to be blurred. How are we gonna do that? We're gonna eventually use a compound blur effect using this texture as a map for that blur effect. And that's gonna kind of give us this rough, shiny ground with areas that don't reflect as well. We'll show you how all that works. But the first thing we need to do is we now need to make a new comp from this ground texture comp. So we're gonna do new comp from selection. Let's go ahead and rename this. And we're gonna call this ground map. All right. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna make this layer 3D. And we are going to kind of rotate it into position about how we think the ground is gonna look. And that's gonna be almost at 90 degrees. Actually, let's make it 90 degrees. And let's go ahead and bring its position down where we want that horizon to be. I'd say right about there. That's looking good. Now, I want to fill out the areas to the left, to the right, and underneath. The best way to do that is, again, with the CC Reptile effect. Let's bring that in. Let's go ahead and bring the right out. Now, we are gonna go a little bit further than it looks like we need because this ground is gonna be moving around. So let's say 1,000, 1,000. And let's bring in the down. Oh, nope. Gotta bring in the up. There we go. Bring that quite a ways out. Let's say 1,500. All right, so like I said before, the areas that are white are gonna be unblurred. The areas that are black are going to be blurred, but you'll notice this whole up area is black, which means it's gonna get a lot of blur. We want that to be white. Best way to do that, go ahead and create a new solid. Make sure this solid is white and drop it just behind our ground texture. There we go. We could use it right now, but I'd like to add just a little bit of fade of this texture as it goes into the background so it's not just this sharp line. So the best way we're gonna do that is to create a new shape. Let's make sure the shape is white. Perfect. And let's go ahead and drag that out right about there. That looks great. Let's go ahead and center the pivot on that just to make things easier later. Let's move it up a little bit. Right about there, I think is good. And let's add a Gaussian blur effect. We're gonna pump these numbers up pretty high. There we go. And let's bring this down. You can kind of see we now get this nice fade. I don't want the fade to be too big, just enough. Let's go ahead and bring that back down to about right there. I think that's perfect. So now we have our ground map texture that we're gonna pump into the blur. So next thing we need is the text. Let's make a new composition. Let's call this one text. Let's go ahead and create a new text layer. Let's call it shiny ground. Now, one thing I like to do for an effect like this is I kind of really like the whole neon kind of look. So we are gonna switch the fill and the stroke, bring that stroke probably up to about, let's say 3 pixels. Let's make this text a little bit bigger. Make that a little bit nicer there. Yeah, I think that'll work. Go ahead and center the pivot. Let's go ahead and align this in our comp. I think that's perfect. Now, one thing we do need to do is we do need to bring this text up just a little bit because of the way our eventual mirror effect is going to work. All right, so let's go ahead and make one more new comp. Let's call this main. Let's go ahead and bring in everything we need. First is the text layer. Next is the ground map layer. Let's go ahead and hide the ground map layer for now because we don't need it. Let's look at this text layer and let's add a mirror effect. There's a couple different ways you can do this. You could just duplicate the layer, flip it over, but I like the mirror effect because it's nice and easy to use. Let's go ahead and set the angle here at 90. And you can kind of already see what this mirror is doing. If you look at the reflection center and you move this Y value, should give you a pretty good idea of how this one works. Let's go ahead and put it right about there. Next up, we need to add our blur. We're gonna do that with an adjustment layer. Let's go ahead and call this compound blur. And let's go ahead and add a compound blur. You'll notice it's now blurring everything. That is definitely not what we want, so we need to put a map in. Right here under blur layer, we're gonna choose our ground map. And it's still not quite there. What's going on here? Well, by default, black is actually no blur, white is a lot of blur. That hurts my brain for whatever reason, so I switch it up when I do, my white and black maps. So invert it, and that gives us what we're looking for. And you can already kind of see what's going on here. And that's, looking kind of good, but not quite right. Well, first things first, you can see how much lower our ground layer is to our text layer. And that's probably not gonna work, so we're gonna have to make some changes there. So let's do it in 2 ways. First, let's bring down our text layer just a little bit. And then next, let's go into our ground map and let's bring this up just a bit. And actually, we need to bring both of these up at the same time. So we're gonna select both of them, hit P to open up their position properties, and go ahead and drag it up right about there. Let's hop back to our main. That is looking a little bit better there. Let's go ahead and turn off the ground map. Yeah, kind of getting a better idea of what the ground's gonna look like. Let's bring our text down just a little bit more. I'd say right about there. That's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and make our text layer 3D. Let's add a new camera. Let's make it a 2-node camera. Not too worried about the settings right now. Let's move around and see how this is working. And we can already see there's a big issue. That texture for the ground isn't moving. Now, first thought might be, oh, it's not a 3D layer, that's why it's not moving around. But if we make it 3D and we show it, it doesn't really make a change either. What you need to do is you need to check this flag for collapse transformations. It's also the one for continuously raster, but for comp layer, it is to collapse transformations. And so if we turn that on, now when we move the camera, you can see how it's adjusting that ground area. Let's go ahead and turn off that ground map. Let's move this camera around a little bit. All right, that's starting to look a little bit better, but we're not quite there. Couple of things I want to change. The first one is I want to add another blur. I think this is far too crisp down here in the reflection, and I think the compound blur probably isn't strong enough. So let's start with the compound blur. Let's bring this up to, I'd say about 65. Gives us a little bit more detail on the ground there. And let's make a new adjustment layer. Let's call this lens blur. Let's go ahead and add a camera lens blur to it. And again, you can see it's affecting everything, and that's not what we want. We just want it to affect this area down here. So that means we need to make a blur map. And let's do one real quick. Let's start by creating a new solid. Let's make sure it's white. And let's go ahead and create a shape. And let's make sure that shape is black. We're gonna drag it out right about there. Center the pivot on that. And let's add a Gaussian blur to create a nice gradient. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. So let's turn off this solid and let's take a look here. We don't want it to affect the main part of our text at the top. We just want it to affect the reflection down below. So let's drag this right about there. That's looking pretty good. Turn that back on. Pre-comp these two layers together. Let's call it blur map. Let's go ahead and hide it. Turn on our lens blur. Apply that map here. And of course, just like earlier, because I work backwards, invert it. All right, that is already looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and let's just keyframe our camera real quick here. And let's move it up to about here. Go ahead, actually, let's start it just a ways a bit. And let's go here. Bring it in, bring the camera up, rotate it around a little bit. Right about there. All right, let's go ahead and do a quick RAM preview, see how this looks. All right, so let's go ahead and scrub through this. That is not bad. I've still got a couple issues with it. I think we could use a little bit more detail on the ground. I think our ground layer is probably not exactly where we want it to be, but let's go ahead, let's make some of those changes now. First off, let's go back into our ground map. I would say this shape layer probably is fading off a little too much, so we just want a little fade here at the top. Let's go ahead and pop back into our ground texture as well, and let's bring in a little bit more of the dark areas by reducing the brightness on our contrast. There we go. Hop back in, take a look at that. Ooh, much nicer. Definitely feels like much more of a physical piece of ground. So I like where that's at. The next thing is I want to add a little bit more blur to that camera lens blur, but not much. Kind of subtle here. Let's bring it up to about 8. I think that looks pretty good. All right, we need to bring our text layer up just a smidge here. There we go. And there you have it. At this point, the effect is done. You've got the shiny ground. It will reflect and kind of do this compound blur distortion to make it look like it's, concrete ground that's got a little bit of water on it or some rough parts where the polish has come off. But that is the whole effect. But you can go a little further and sell it a little bit more with a nice glow. Like I said, I love the idea of the neon lights making our kind of text here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a glow effect. Now, you can make a really great glow in After Effects with just the built-in plugins, and I will make a tutorial on how to do that soon. But for today, we are just gonna use my second favorite plugin of all time, and that is Deep Glow. I use this on almost every project I work on because it saves time. You can absolutely replicate this yourself with multiple glow effects and a little bit of time and tweaking, but when you can just throw Deep Glow on something, just saves you time, and anything where I can cut some corners and still come out with a good quality product is something I'm gonna use. So we're gonna throw Deep Glow onto here. We're gonna change the tint to my favorite hot pink color. Pretty good. And we're gonna throw on some chromatic aberration, mostly just because I like the look and it, breaks up the color a little bit more. Let's go ahead and back into our main, and you can see now that we've got the glow, and you get a little bit more detail in this ground map, it's looking a lot better. But there's one thing I don't like, and that is my lens blur being over top of my compound blur. Let's drag that right underneath, and immediately we get this beautiful, reflected, shiny ground. So let's go ahead and do one more RAM preview of this and see how it looks. All right, let's take a look here. That looks pretty good. And you don't have to do this with just a text effect. You could put an animation up there, you could put a video up there, straight image, doesn't matter, whatever you want. It's a very simple effect that just relies on having this ground map going into a compound blur. The lens blur is nice because I think, it makes a little bit more sense that it's not gonna be a perfectly crisp reflection here. And obviously the glow kind of helps sell the effect a little bit more with the fade off and the highlights. But that's it. That's all you need to make this effect. Very quick, very short. Renders fairly fast as well. And frankly, I think it looks pretty damn good. But that is it for today's tutorial. If you liked it and you'd like to see more, go ahead and give me a like and a subscribe. That would be super rad. And if you've got any ideas for any more tutorials, go ahead and leave it down in the comments and I will definitely be taking a look.